On a cool October day in 1945, Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer arrived at the White House in Washington, D.C. A 30-minute meeting had been scheduled with President Harry S. Truman. A meeting that could shape the course of history. That morning, Dr. Robert Oppenheimer was making an attempt to reason with the president. He had just led a team of scientists in developing and testing a weapon that helped bring about the end of the Second World War. Now he was desperate to prevent the world from destroying itself. After the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Oppenheimer had followed military developments with deep concern. He felt compelled to personally share his fears about this devastating new weapon with the American president. The events of October 25th, 1945 marked a turning point in history. But the story began years earlier with Hitler's invasion of Poland in 1939, which triggered the Second World War. As German forces advanced across Europe, European émigré physicists working in the United States learned that their counterparts in Berlin were experimenting with nuclear fission. Fearing its potential as a weapon, they approached Albert Einstein and persuaded him to collaborate in writing a letter warning President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The letter raised the alarm that Nazi Germany might be the first to develop an atomic bomb. In response, Roosevelt mobilized US resources to stay ahead. By executive order, he created the Manhattan Engineer District, placing atomic research at the center of the American war effort. To lead this unprecedented project, the Army appointed General Leslie Groves, a seasoned officer who had recently overseen construction of the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., a significant military achievement. Under Groves, the Manhattan Engineer District grew rapidly, employing 75,000 Americans. Its structure was compartmentalized to protect secrecy and maintain focus. Groves knew he needed a brilliant scientist, someone who could lead with vision, rally the nation's top minds, and drive progress at a record pace. After careful consideration, General Groves arrived at his decision.
I was completely responsible for the selection of Dr. Oppenheimer as the head of the Los Alamos bomb laboratory.
Dr. Oppenheimer already knew many of the top scientists and physicists of the era. He had the charisma, intellect, and leadership skills needed to unite them behind a single mission. When Groves and Oppenheimer met for the first time, their top priority was finding a remote location for a secret laboratory, where the scientists could live and work around the clock in complete isolation. Oppenheimer suggested a place in northern New Mexico where he had spent time with his family. He had hiked the hills, ridden horses through the terrain, and even leased a simple cabin there. He remembered a nearby ranch school set on a mesa. It seemed ideal. The two men drove out to see it. The old school grounds had solid infrastructure, access to water, and room for expansion. Groves turned to Oppenheimer and said, "This is it." The property was quickly secured for the government, and work began immediately on guardhouses and roads. Oppenheimer started assembling a team of top scientists, engineers, and experts from across the country. A laboratory was built, and structures began to rise almost overnight. Hundreds of workers and support staff arrived, The guardhouse soon became a hub of activity. Scientists came with their families. Among them was Oppenheimer's wife, Catherine, known as Kitty, who was his confidant and constant companion. Kitty welcomed new arrivals, organized social events, and became the de facto First Lady of Los Alamos. As research advanced, military planners began searching for a nearby location to test the world's first atomic bomb. The test site needed to be far from populated areas and inaccessible to the public. A location north of Alamogordo, New Mexico was selected. It lay in a desert known as the Jordana del Muerto, Spanish for Journey of the Dead. The area had already been secured by the military and used for bombing practice. Eyewitnesses later recalled that Oppenheimer played a key role in selecting the site. He reportedly slept under a truck during the search and seemed more at ease in the desert than many of his colleagues. Over time, a small base camp rose from the barren terrain. Oppenheimer named the site Trinity. Several buildings were constructed at the test location, including barracks and a canteen. There was even a pool table for the workers. When the bomb was finally ready for testing, a tall steel tower was built. The idea was to detonate the device above ground to better observe and measure its effects. By late April 1945, Allied forces had retaken most of Germany and were closing in on Berlin. Berlin soon fell, and the entire country came under Allied control. German soldiers surrendered, and many members of the Nazi regime were captured. American intelligence teams recovered a vast trove of secret military documents. After Germany's surrender, US intelligence agents rushed to the Peenemünde rocket facility, where Wernher von Braun had led the development of the German V-2 rocket. In a nearby cave, American troops discovered 14 tons of technical papers and hundreds of rocket components. But the agents uncovered an even greater secret: that the Germans, under von Braun's supervision, had been developing a rocket intended to strike New York City. Alongside tons of rocket components, technical drawings and documents, the American troops discovered that Dr. von Braun and his team of German scientists were working on the development of long-range weapons that might one day reach transatlantic targets. This research, they realized, could be of great benefit to the US military. The findings were quickly relayed to President Truman, who ordered all materials and the scientists to be secured and shipped to the United States without delay. The US military acted swiftly, transporting the rocket parts and equipment, technical documents, and more than 100 German scientists and their families, including Wernher von Braun, to the United States. The Pentagon decided the best location for this top-secret cargo was the New Mexico desert, near the atomic test site. Almost overnight, New Mexico became the focal point of global attention. It was now home not only to Los Alamos and the Trinity test site, but also the center of a newly planned rocket testing range. Although the Allies now controlled Germany and much of Europe, Japan continued to fight fiercely in the Pacific theater. In the weeks following Germany's surrender, a conference of Allied leaders was planned to address Europe's post-war administration and to coordinate the final stages of the war against Japan. The meeting was scheduled to begin on July 17, 1945 in Potsdam, and later became known as the Potsdam Conference. Truman's Secretary of War, Henry Stinson, who received daily updates on the Manhattan Project, was aware that the first atomic bomb test was imminent. Stimson requested that President Truman authorize an accelerated timeline for the test in the desert of New Mexico, so that its outcome could align with the opening of the Potsdam Conference. If the test proved successful, Truman could enter the conference with news of a powerful new weapon as leverage for his negotiations with the Allies. Truman agreed to the accelerated timeline and instructed General Groves to notify the Los Alamos scientists that the test must occur before the Potsdam meeting, meaning no later than July 16th. Dr. Oppenheimer called a meeting at Camp Lodge in Los Alamos. The scientist agreed that, with full cooperation across all departments, the test could be moved forward. Enriched plutonium was prepared in the Los Alamos lab ahead of the test. Under Oppenheimer's supervision, the plutonium was loaded onto military vehicles. It was then driven south through New Mexico, arriving hours later at the Trinity site, 340 kilometers away. With great care, the components were assembled at the test site. The plutonium core was inserted into the bomb, nicknamed the Gadget. Under Oppenheimer's watchful eye, the team completed the final assembly. In the tower above, men were prepared to lift the bomb using hoists. While those below worked the pulleys, the team at the top monitored the process using mirrors. Once the bomb reached the top, the floor was sealed and technicians wired and inspected the device to ensure the test could proceed as planned. Oppenheimer notified General Groves that the test was ready for July 16th. Groves relayed the news to President Truman, who was already at the conference in Potsdam. On the morning of the test, light rain and distant lightning threatened a delay, but the skies eventually cleared. At 5:29 a.m. on July 16th, 1945, the world's first atomic bomb was detonated in the New Mexico desert. The atomic age had begun. The United States now possessed a weapon capable of ending the war and compelling Japan to surrender. News of the successful test was sent immediately to President Truman in Potsdam via coded telegram. The message read, "Doctor has just returned, most enthusiastic and confident that the little boy is as husky as his big brother." A New York Times reporter, who was part of the official observation group, later described the moment as if he were present when God created the first light. General Groves recorded in his classified report that the bomb test was probably more important than the discovery of electricity. Back at the control room, the scientists reacted with a mix of awe and unease. One of them remarked, "We are probably now all sons of bitches." Cigarettes and beer were passed around in subdued celebration. The explosion had been audible from 160 kilometers away. To avoid public alarm, a press release was issued claiming that a munitions depot had accidentally exploded. Just hours after the successful test, the USS Indianapolis set sail from San Francisco, heading for the Pacific island of Tinian. On board were components and plutonium for a second bomb, intended for use against Japan. Meanwhile, with news of the test in hand, President Truman showed a noticeable shift in confidence at Potsdam. As the conference continued, all Allied leaders were briefed on the new weapon and its likely deployment in the Pacific theater. Truman felt particularly strengthened in his interactions with Churchill and Stalin. By the end of the conference, all of the Allies had been informed about the new bomb and its imminent deployment in Japan.
I told Stalin about the atomic explosion, which had been set off on the 16th day of July down in Alamogordo, New Mexico, and explained to him that we had the most powerful explosive that had ever been discovered in the history of the world, and that we expected to use it on Japan. He smiled at me and bowed and said he was glad we had the explosive, and he hoped that it would end the Japanese war.
Back in New Mexico, Oppenheimer, General Groves, and the scientists visited the blast site. Their hard work had paid off. The experiment had worked. Oppenheimer returned to Los Alamos, exhausted but reflective. He began to consider the bomb's next use. Should there be a demonstration first? Should the Japanese be warned and urged to surrender? What would his colleagues think now that the theoretical had become real? The sight of the Los Alamos guardhouse was a welcome relief. He was home at last. Soon after returning, Oppenheimer convened a meeting of the scientific team to address the ethical concerns that had emerged. In the Oak Ridge and Chicago Manhattan project sites, many scientists signed a petition urging the president that Japan should first be given the opportunity to surrender and that the weapon should only be used as a last resort. More than 20 years later, Oppenheimer recalled what he and his colleagues thought at the time.
I think that it probably was assumed, it certainly was always assumed at Los Alamos, that if the war were not over and not clearly to be brought to a conclusion by diplomatic means, this weapon would play a part. I'm not sure that the men who sat around that room all had the same idea of what would happen with the bomb.
General Groves blocked the petition and the scientists' effort to reach Truman directly. The president then issued the order. The first atomic bomb would be dropped on Japan. By then, the Indianapolis had reached Tinian Island. The bomb, codenamed Little Boy, was carefully unloaded from the ship and transported to a hangar. On the eve of the mission, military technicians rolled the bomb out to the waiting aircraft. Tension spread among the crew. Rumours had circulated that this was the weapon that could end the war. After several hours of careful preparation, the bomb was loaded into the Boeing B-29 aircraft. Just before dawn, the Enola Gay took off for Hiroshima. A few hours later, on the morning of Monday, August 6, 1945, the first atomic bomb ever used in warfare was dropped on Hiroshima. This is the only known authentic footage of the explosion. A blast that caused unprecedented devastation. Meanwhile, the final assembly of the second bomb on Tinian Island was nearing completion. A tactical and operational flight order detailed the timing, logistics, and other elements of the mission. Codenamed Fat Man, the bomb was similar in design to the Trinity device. On August 8th, it was carefully removed from the hangar and prepared for the mission. It was first painted with a sealant. Then it was armed and transported to the runway for loading. Once again, a B-29 bomber was carefully prepared and brought into position. It took off at dawn. On August 9th, 1945, the second atomic bomb was dropped over Nagasaki. The city had been chosen as a secondary target due to poor weather conditions. The Japanese military could offer only minimal resistance. Within a single month, 3 atomic bombs were detonated at Alamogordo, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki. The world was forever changed. The overwhelming destruction led to the expected surrender of Japan, bringing the Second World War to an end. Following the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Robert Oppenheimer and his fellow scientists came under growing scrutiny, facing difficult questions about the ethics and long-term implications of their work.
I remember that we first responded to the question, what do scientists think, by saying that they think a variety of things, and this is only natural. On the one hand, they hoped this instrument would never be used in war, and therefore they hoped that we would not start out by using it. On the other hand, they hoped, or other people hoped, that it would put an end to this war, save countless lives, put an end to it.
It would have come out sooner or later in a congressional hearing, if nowhere else, just when we could have dropped the bomb if we didn't use it. And then, knowing American politics, you know as well as I do that there have been elections fought on the basis that every mother whose son was killed after such and such a date, the blood is on the head of the president.
The question was whether we wanted to save our people and Japanese as well and win the war, or whether we wanted to take a chance on being able to win the war by killing all our young men.
As peace returned, celebrations erupted across the United States. The war was over, and the American public welcomed victory with relief and pride. Dr. Robert Oppenheimer became a household name for his role in creating the atomic bomb and helping to end the war. Meanwhile, President Truman saw the weapon as a powerful tool to strengthen his position, both at home and on the global stage, and particularly vis-à-vis the Soviet Union. With encouragement from his military advisors, he began to pursue a strategy of expanding US military dominance through nuclear superiority. The bomb had changed not just warfare, but the direction of American military policy.
As the war was shaping up and they were seeing that, with almost certainty they were going to be able to make these bombs, my grandfather, in particular Niels Bohr's influence, started turning their thoughts towards, could this power of these weapons end all war? That's what they started thinking about. Not, are we going to make these bombs and then control these bombs themselves? But they saw that there was a change in humanity, the way humanity kind of relates to each other, because such powerful technology has been made that you could end humanity if you have a total war. And that was something that the scientists really started focusing on, and that also, furthermore, there was a way to control that. And the military side and the government and the political side was not caught up to that. They were kind of still thinking of these things like muskets or cannons. We have a weapon, let's make as many weapons as we can and we'll be more powerful, and that's good. But the scientists, in particular my grandfather and Niels Bohr and some of the other scientists, thought that the significance of this particular type of technology is that we would have to work together in humanity in a new way, because if we didn't, it would inevitably end in an arms race and then using the weapons against each other and destroy everything. And turning towards that problem is what he did, while simultaneously finishing his duty and his work that he had to do, which was fight a war. He was in a war like everybody else.
Meanwhile, General Groves had received a top-secret memo from the US Army Air Force's headquarters. Dated September 15th, 1945, the document laid out plans to begin immediate mass production of atomic weapons. This was in direct opposition to what Oppenheimer had hoped for. The memo identified the Soviet Union as the likely future adversary. An optimum strike, the memo continued, would target 66 cities of strategic importance, which would require 204 nuclear bombs, enough to destroy the country. By the fall of 1945, it was clear that the military wanted to rapidly expand its nuclear arsenal, and this message was passed directly to President Truman. At the same time, growing discontent was spreading among many scientists at Los Alamos, who had not expected such escalation. Dr. Oppenheimer, who presumably was aware of the memo and the planned production of 204 atomic bombs, was deeply concerned. Scientists at the lab urged him to take action and deliver their concerns directly to the Secretary of War and to the President. A recently uncovered memorandum describing a September 24, 1945 meeting reveals the mounting tension among those who had built the bomb. It noted, "There is a distinct opposition on their part to doing any more work on any bomb, not merely a super bomb, but any bomb." Oppenheimer asked George Harrison, assistant to the Secretary of War, to arrange a meeting with President Truman as soon as possible. He still believed that open dialogue between scientists, political leaders, and nations could help contain the role of nuclear weapons in future conflicts. When General Groves learned of the resistance at Los Alamos, he quickly moved to divide the scientists into two separate groups. One group would continue with non-military research. The other would work on new atomic weapons. To build 204 bombs, the military needed a larger facility that could operate around the clock. Los Alamos was no longer adequate. Plans were drawn up for a new base near Albuquerque called Sandia. There, bomb design and production would continue. Storage bunkers were included in the plans. In October 1945, two key military developments took place in New Mexico. The first was the departure of the 509th Composite Group, the same unit that had dropped the bombs, from Tinian Island for their new posting at Walker Army Air Base in Roswell. The base was designed to support B-29 bombers and prepare them for atomic missions. The Enola Gay, which had bombed Hiroshima, was part of this transfer. Colonel Patrick Henry Sanders was the assistant base commander. His daughter Susan still recalls the importance of the Roswell Air Base.
The importance of Roswell was it was the only nuclear strike force base in the world at the time. It was the place that had the nuclear bombs and was highly classified information that was going on between Los Alamos and Alamogordo and Fort Bliss and Roswell.
The second development was the arrival of the first German V-2 rockets at the newly established White Sands Proving Grounds, formerly the Alamogordo Bombing and Gunnery Range, where the first atomic bomb had been tested just 2 months earlier. A military report by General Hap Arnold urged the United States to pursue a nuclear-armed rocket program. The German technology was now in American hands. Oppenheimer learned of both events and saw the direction military policy was taking. The acceleration of nuclear weapons development deeply troubled him. He submitted his resignation as director of Los Alamos. News of Oppenheimer's resignation spread quickly through Los Alamos. General Groves and the scientific team wanted to honor Oppenheimer before his departure. A ceremony to mark the bestowal of the Army-Navy Excellence Award was the perfect opportunity. Oppenheimer decided the E-Award ceremony on October 16, 1945, would be his last day at the lab. The event was both a celebration and a solemn goodbye. In his speech, Oppenheimer would voice the concerns that weighed heavily on him. General Groves introduced Dr. Oppenheimer to the assembled guests and staff. After receiving his certificate of appreciation, Oppenheimer addressed the gathering with a short but powerful speech. "It is our hope," Oppenheimer said, "that in years to come we may look at this scroll and all that it signifies with pride. Today, that pride must be tempered with a profound concern. If atomic bombs are to be added as new weapons to the arsenals of a warring world, or to the arsenals of nations preparing for war, then the time will come when mankind will curse the name of Los Alamos and of Hiroshima. The peoples of this world must unite or they will perish." His words reflected deep anxiety about the future. His warning moved many of those who listened that day. The Los Alamos community was shaken by Oppenheimer's departure. His exit only heightened anticipation for the meeting at the White House with President Truman, which was set to go forward despite his resignation. Oppenheimer remained convinced that open communication between scientists, political leaders, and the international community was essential to limit the threat of nuclear weapons. This was the message he wanted to give to President Truman, but Truman granted him only a 30-minute meeting. Oppenheimer, now a civilian, was entering a political arena where he held little sway. Secretary of Commerce Henry Wallace, who observed his arrival, wrote in his diary, "I never saw a man in such a nervous state as Oppenheimer. He seemed to feel that the destruction of the human race was imminent." Truman and Oppenheimer had very different visions for the future of nuclear weapons. Truman was already moving ahead with plans to adapt German V-2 rocket technology for atomic delivery. Observers said Oppenheimer appeared as if he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. When the meeting began, President Truman asked him, "Dr. Oppenheimer, when will the Russians develop a nuclear weapon?" Oppenheimer replied, "Mr. President, I don't know." Truman raised his voice and said, "Never." Then he made a statement.
"We have spent more than $2 billion on the greatest scientific gamble in history, and we have won. But the greatest marvel is not the size of the enterprise, its secrecy, or its cost, but the achievement of scientific brains in making it work.
We have made a thing, a most terrible weapon, that has altered abruptly and profoundly the nature of the world. We have made a thing that by all the standards of the world we grew up in is an evil thing."
Well, there's one thing I can say to you, that any schoolboy's hindsight's worth all a president's or a general's foresight. Don't you know that any schoolboy's afterthought's worth more than all a general's forethought? So afterthoughts and things after the fact have no effect on making a decision when it's time to make it at the time. You have to work on what you know at that time. And that's what I did, and I'm not sorry for it.
Oppenheimer looked President Truman in the eye and said, "Mr. President, I feel I have blood on my hands." The remark infuriated Truman, who replied bluntly, "Listen, the blood is on my hands. You let me worry about that." After the meeting, Truman was heard muttering, "Blood on his hands? Damn it. He hasn't half as much blood on his hands as I have. You just don't go around belly aching about it." Truman insisted that nuclear war must be conducted without tears. He later instructed Secretary of State Dean Acheson, "I don't want to see that son of a bitch in this office ever again. He didn't set that bomb off. I did." In other comments, Truman dismissed Oppenheimer as a crybaby scientist. It was clear the two men had fundamentally different views on the meaning and future of nuclear weapons. When Oppenheimer exited the White House, reporters immediately asked him how the meeting had gone.
In the years to come, it will be possible to kill 40 million American people in the 20 largest American towns by the use of atomic bombs in a single night. I am afraid that the answer to that question is yes. I think the only hope for our future safety must lie in a collaboration based on confidence and good faith with the other peoples of the world.
Several universities learned that Dr. Oppenheimer wished to return to academic life. He received numerous offers, including from the California Institute of Technology in Pasadena. Oppenheimer decided not to accept a full-time faculty position and instead gave lectures. Although he now had more time with his family, he realized that his heart was no longer in teaching. He still held a security clearance and remained involved in national policy, serving on the board of the Atomic Development Authority, later the Atomic Energy Commission. He continued advocating for the controlled exchange of nuclear knowledge, the foundation of a global network of nuclear scientists, and the global limitation of nuclear arms. He spoke publicly about both the dangers and the hope of the atomic age, often quoting Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. As a statesman, he left a lasting impression. He appeared on the covers of Time, Life, and other national magazines, and was nominated 4 times for the Nobel Prize in Physics. During this period, Oppenheimer emerged as a leading public intellectual, regularly consulted on science and policy by both American and international figures. In 1947, Oppenheimer was invited by Louis Strauss to become the director of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. This role allowed him to continue his work with leading scientists and expand his influence. But the partnership with Strauss would later prove fateful and result in the loss of his security clearance. At the urging of Dr. Edward Teller, a former colleague from Los Alamos, the US Congress was persuaded to fund the development of a more powerful hydrogen bomb. Oppenheimer opposed the project and appealed to Congress to halt funding. His opposition angered Strauss, who had become chairman of the US Atomic Energy Commission. Alongside President Eisenhower, Strauss championed a more aggressive military posture. In public hearings, Oppenheimer's resistance embarrassed Chairman Strauss. It was the final straw. Soon afterwards, Strauss and a small circle in Washington, among them FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, began circulating false claims that Oppenheimer was tied to communists and posed a national security risk. Despite objections from local FBI agents, some conversations between Oppenheimer and his legal team were secretly recorded. His attorney, Lloyd Garrison, was not permitted to know the full list of witnesses that could be called at the hearing. On several occasions during the hearing, Garrison was asked to leave the room when classified matters were discussed. A list of more than 40 witnesses was presented, yet no concrete evidence was produced. The hearing became an inquisition, aimed not at justice, but at discrediting Oppenheimer.
I was completely responsible for the selection of Dr. Oppenheimer as the head of the Los Alamos bomb laboratory. Nothing has happened during the affair or afterwards that led me to believe that that was not a wise choice.
After the decision was made, Strauss called Oppenheimer to inform him that his security clearance had been revoked. The response was swift. 494 scientists from Los Alamos signed a protest, risking their careers. Declassified records, including the full hearing transcripts, confirm that no credible evidence was ever presented. Notes from Oppenheimer's longtime secretary, Dorothy McKibben, showed that on the day the FBI alleged he met a communist sympathizer in Berkeley, he was actually in New Mexico. Oppenheimer's disillusionment was clear in the statements he gave after the ruling.
What your thoughts are about what our atomic policy should be?
No, I can't do that. I'm not close enough to the facts, and I'm not close enough to the thoughts of those who are worrying about it.
It is very clear that the concept "thou shalt not kill" has been complicated in recent years.
Science has profoundly altered the conditions of man's life, both materially and in ways of the spirit as well. It has extended the range of questions in which man has a choice. It has extended man's freedom to make significant decisions. No one can predict what vast new continents of knowledge the future of science will discover. But we know that as long as men are free to ask what they will, free to say what they think, free to think what they must, science will never regress, and freedom itself will never be wholly lost.
The revocation of his clearance effectively ended Oppenheimer's influence in government and cut him off from the very world he had helped shape. He later described the security hearing as a farce. Though he continued to lecture, he spent increasing time at his secluded retreat on the island of St. John in the US Virgin Islands. There, he built a modest beach house and spent his days sailing with his wife Kitty and daughter Tony. Despite his isolation, international admiration endured. In 1957, France made him an officer of the Legion of Honor.
Your thinking reflects that of Socrates. Do you believe that for scientists, what is important is to know oneself?
For everybody, not just for scientists.
Do you believe that scientists are better able to know themselves through their work and their discoveries?
No, it's a separate thing.
In 1963, in an effort to acknowledge the injustice of the past, President John F. Kennedy's advisors proposed awarding Oppenheimer the Enrico Fermi Award. Kennedy, an admirer, approved the gesture and set a date for a ceremony at the White House. But just 1 week before the event, Kennedy was assassinated. His successor, President Lyndon B. Johnson, presented the award.
I think it just possible, Mr. President, that it has taken some clarity and some courage for you to make this award today.
Despite her grief, Jacqueline Kennedy attended the ceremony. She emphasized how meaningful the award would have been to her husband. Her presence moved Oppenheimer deeply. In 1960, He fulfilled a personal wish by visiting Japan and seeing firsthand the destruction caused by the atomic bomb. By the end of his life, Oppenheimer had made peace with his role in shaping the atomic age. In a 1965 interview with the New York Times Magazine, he reflected on that legacy. "I never regretted, and do not regret now, having done my part of the job." Robert Oppenheimer died of throat cancer on February 18, 1967. His funeral at Princeton was attended by friends, colleagues, and dignitaries. His body was cremated, and his ashes were scattered by Kitty from a small boat off the coast of their home on St. John. The beach is now referred to as Oppenheimer Beach. During one of his final lectures, he was asked a deeply personal question about his life.
Will you comment on what contribution, if any, Jesus Christ in his gospel may have to you or science? I really wouldn't know about science, because this is a matter of history which I am sure is very tangled. It is hard to imagine the history of Europe without Christ, and it's hard to imagine the history of science without Europe. As for myself, I would be the poor. I don't know whether I'd be a worse or better scientist, but that's not what you wanted to know.
Dr. Robert Oppenheimer had worked relentlessly to help his country bring an end to a brutal world war. He succeeded, only to be later discredited by the same nation he had served. His offense? Advocating for peace through cooperation. Today, his message remains as urgent and relevant as it was in his time.
What should we do after the war? How should we handle this technology that we made? And so the Interim Scientific Committee released their report on August 17, 1945, and it was a written report, and it had 5 points, and it was chaired by Robert Oppenheimer, but it was Lawrence, Fermi, Compton maybe. It was a group of them, and they worked days and days and days on 5 points and debated them back and forth. And those 5 points are literally as valid today as the day they were written. And it said that these weapons will get more powerful, we'll probably go into the business of trying to make a lot more of them, and there is a way to control it, and it is only through scientific openness and cooperation. And these were not kind of radical, wild ideas. These guys were in the government, they were on the inside, and they were the most respected scientists in the world, saying that we can control this technology and we have to treat it differently than other military uses. And that wasn't an intuitive idea, and it wasn't resoundingly rejected. I mean, these guys created this technology and they're saying this is how you handle it. And there was a chance that that advice could have just directly been taken. The military says, what should we do with this? And the government, and they could have listened to the scientists and managed it the way they proposed from that very beginning period. And when I look back on history, I think it's worth talking over that period and all the way through 1947 over and over and over again, and have people understand how close and how clear it was to the scientists how we should manage this technology, and how effectively just arbitrary bureaucratic decisions did the exact opposite of what they advised and went into an arms race and almost destroyed the world. It's not like they thought their path out. They did think their path out. They said, I disagree with you scientists. You don't know what you're talking about. We'll do it our way. And we had 70 years to test it. And it turns out the scientists were 100% right, except for blowing ourselves up, which to this day is an open question. We could all die. So that was a really interesting period that they wrote down, provided this advice, tried to deliver it, and it didn't get there.